year was 1876, and the Arizona Territory was baked into a red brick. In the town of Dust Mesa, even the wind seemed thirsty. It came off the flats without mercy, a hot breath that scoured the plank fronts of the buildings and carried a fine grit that settled into the folds of a man's shirt and the lines around a woman's eyes. The dust was the color of old blood, a constant reminder of the hardness of the land and the lives eked out upon it. Dust Mesa was not so much a town as a raw nerve ending on the edge of nowhere. It had a wooden stockade at one end, a stagecoach station at the other, and a single, wide street connecting them. Along that street stood the essentials of survival and sin, a general store, a telegraph office that hummed with news from a world away, and the Copper Lantern, a saloon whose bat-wing doors swung open and shut like a weary mouth. Across from it, the small church with its tin roof threw a stark, angular shadow that did little to cool the ground. Its preacher, Reverend Hart, believed faith could move mountains, but he had yet to see it conjure a single drop of rain. His daughter, Evelyn Hart, held a different kind of faith. It was a belief in the unyielding logic of letters and numbers, inside a converted storeroom behind the church. She ran a small, free school for any child who would come. The air inside was thick with the smell of chalk dust and unwashed bodies. But for Evelyn, it was a sanctuary from the town's simmering anxieties. She stood before a half-dozen children, her back straight as the ruler she held in her hand. Her hair, the color of autumn hay, was pinned in a severe bun that allowed no stray strands to escape. She was in her early 20s. A woman whose clear blue eyes saw the world in terms of right and wrong, a ledger of moral certainties learned at her father's knee. The town saw her as the preacher's daughter, a figure of untouchable propriety, a virgin in spirit as much as in body. They did not see the high walls she had built around her heart, not out of piety, but out of a quiet, unnameable fear of the world's disorder. She pointed the ruler at the slate, a young boy with dark eyes and skin the color of polished walnut. A Métis boy named Toby correctly spelled the word a drought. Evelyn offered him a small, rare smile. He was her brightest pupil, a boy who straddled two worlds and was fully at home in neither. He soaked up knowledge like the parched earth finally receiving a storm. While Evelyn taught the children about a world ordered by grammar, two men in the sheriff's office were busy imposing their own kind of order on Dust Mesa. Baron Rigg, the cattleman whose herds trampled 1,000 acres of territory, filled the small room with his presence. He was a big man, florid and sweating in a wool suit that must have cost more than the office's entire furnishings. His voice was a low rumble of satisfaction. He spoke to the sheriff about the necessity of progress. He talked about a new cattle trail, about securing the future of Dust Mesa. But beneath the grand words was a single, hard point water. The Spring Knife mountain range held the last reliable source of it for 50 miles, and the mountain Apache lived there. Sheriff Deacon Shaw listened, his chair tilted back against the wall. He was a spare man, all bone and gristle, with a face that looked like it had been carved from dried leather. He said little, letting Rigg's words fill the space. Rigg's plan was simple. He had papers, contracts. He would pay for extra deputies, a private security force to protect his interests. He explained that these interests required the Apache to be moved. It was a matter of public safety, he claimed, a way to prevent friction. Deacon Shaw righted his chair with a soft thud. He agreed that friction was bad for business, for a monthly stipend paid directly to him and the legal cover Rigg's money could provide. He would enforce any new town ordinances required. He would ensure the Apache understood their presence near the Spring Knife Range was no longer welcome. The deal was sealed not with a handshake, but with a shared look of cold, practical understanding. Water was power, and they both intended to have it. Later that afternoon, the town saw Cade Cerolina. He moved not like a man walking through a town, but like a predator moving through another's territory, with a silence and economy of motion that drew the eye. He was Mountain Apache, a man in his early 20s, but the hardships of his life had carved decades into his face. A thin white scar ran from his temple to the corner of his mouth, a permanent accent mark of violence. He wore denim trousers and a plain cotton shirt, the clothes of a settler. But they sat on him differently, unable to disguise the coiled strength in his shoulders or the hunter's gait in his step. Whispers followed him like his own shadow. The people of Dust Mesa knew him as a former army scout, a man who knew the ways of both worlds and was trusted by neither. They also knew him as the man who had fought a band of bounty hunters near the San Pedro River 2 years back. The story had grown with each telling, painting Cade as a figure of savage ferocity. The men he had fought were the kind who were paid for proof of a kill, and they did not distinguish between warrior and child. Cade had not started that fight, but he had finished it. The reputation it earned him was a heavy cloak, one that made people give him a wide berth and look away when his dark, unreadable eyes passed over them. He ignored the stares, his face a mask of stoic indifference. He was on his way to the general store to trade for salt and flour. He sought no trouble, wanting only to complete his task and return to the quiet solitude of the mountains. As evening approached, a false cheer descended upon the Copper Lantern. Baron Rigg was celebrating his new venture, buying rounds of whiskey for anyone who would listen to him boast about the prosperity to come. The saloon was crowded, the air thick with smoke and the smell of cheap liquor. May, the woman who owned the establishment, moved through the tables with a practiced smile that did not reach her weary eyes. She had seen men like Rigg before, men whose ambition left tracks across the lives of others. Sheriff Shaw pushed his way through the crowd and stopped at the bar. He did not order a drink. He unrolled a small, freshly painted sign and placed it on the polished wood. The letters were stark and black. No Indians after dusk. May looked from the sign to the sheriff. She told him this was not necessary, that she had never had trouble. Shaw's voice was low, but it cut through the noise of the room. He informed her it was a new town ordinance, for public safety. He told her to hang it over the door. When she hesitated, his eyes hardened. He added that it would be a shame if she were to lose her license. It was not a request. May took the sign. The wood feeling heavy and unclean in her hands, she pushed through the doors and, with a few reluctant taps of a hammer, nailed the proclamation of hate to the front of her business. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, bleeding purple and orange across the sky. When Cade emerged from the general store, he had a small sack of flour in one hand and a parcel of salt in the other. He saw the new sign on the saloon and his stride did not falter. He had things he needed to purchase there as well, and his business was his own. He pushed through the swinging doors, and the room fell silent. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. Every eye turned to him. Cade walked to the bar, his gaze fixed on May. He placed a coin on the counter and quietly asked for a small block of salt for his horse. May looked at him, her face a mixture of pity and fear. Before she could answer, one of Rigg's men, a burly cowhand drunk on free whiskey and his own importance, stepped forward. He asked Cade if he could not read. He pointed a thick finger toward the door, his voice slurring as he mentioned the sign. Cade did not look at the man. His attention remained on May. He repeated his request for the salt. Another man joined the first, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. He called Cade a savage and told him to get out before he was thrown out. The air was tight, a string pulled taut to the breaking point. The men were goading him, hoping for the reaction that would confirm everything they believed about his people. They wanted the flash of a knife, the explosion of violence that would justify their contempt. Cade's hand rested on the hilt of the blade at his belt. The men saw the movement and smiled, their bodies tensing for the fight. From across the street, her school day over, Evelyn Hart was walking home. The noise from the saloon had drawn her attention, and now, through the gap in the doors, she could see the scene unfolding. She saw the Apache man, the one they called Dangerous, surrounded. She saw the drunken, eager faces of his tormentors. She braced herself for the inevitable shatter of glass and the shouts of a brawl. She had heard the stories about this man. She expected a brutal, swift response. But it never came. Cade's fingers tightened on the hilt of his knife, the leather worn smooth from his grip. A muscle worked in his jaw. He looked at the hateful faces before him, and then his eyes drifted past them, to the sign nailed outside. He held their gaze for a long moment, a silence that was louder than any shout. Then, in a deliberate, controlled motion, he removed his hand from his knife. He picked his coin up off the bar, leaving the salt he came for. Without another word, he turned his back on the men and walked out of the copper lantern. He did not hurry. Each step was measured, calm. The cowhands jeered at his retreating back, their courage bolstered by his refusal to fight. They called him a coward. But Evelyn, watching from the dusty street, saw something entirely different. It was not cowardice. It was a kind of strength she had never witnessed before, a forbearance that was more powerful than any drawn weapon. In a town that communicated with threats and violence, the mountain Apache had chosen silence. He had chosen to endure the insult rather than spill blood over it. As the red dust swirled around his departing figure, Evelyn felt the first crack appear in the high, solid wall around her heart. The world, she was beginning to understand, was not as simple as right and wrong. The quiet that followed Cade's departure from the saloon was a brittle thing, easily broken. In the days that passed, the tension in Dust Mesa did not fade but coiled tighter, like a spring wound to its limit. The new sign on the copper lantern cast a long shadow, and every sunset felt like a closing door. Baron Rigg was not a patient man. He saw Cade's restraint not as strength but as a temporary inconvenience. He needed more than a town ordinance. He needed a justification for war. He sent a telegraph message and, 2 days later, a man named Hank Ravel rode into town. Ravel was not a common drifter. He was lean and precise, with eyes the color of a winter sky that missed nothing. He carried himself with the confidence of a man whose only trade was the finality of death, and he was very good at his trade. He met Rigg not in the public saloon, but in the back room of the land office, a place of ledgers and legal fictions. The air was stale with the smell of old paper and new conspiracy. Rigg laid out his problem. He spoke of Apache raids, of stolen livestock, a narrative Ravel had heard 100 times before. It was the standard overture to the grim music he composed. Ravel listened without comment, rolling a thin cigarillo between his fingers. He was not interested in the truth of the matter. He was interested in the structure of the job. He asked about the target, Cade Cerolina. Ravel nodded slowly. He had heard the name, connected to the skirmish by the San Pedro. This was not some farm boy with a grievance. This was a man with a reputation. The price would be higher. Rigg did not haggle. He pushed a stack of coins across the table, the gold dull in the dim light. He wanted it done cleanly, legally. He needed a story, a crime that would stick. Ravel suggested horse theft. It was a classic, a charge that required little proof beyond an accusation and carried a swift, predetermined sentence in the court of public opinion. He would find a few of Rigg's own horses, lead them out of their paddock, and claim they were recovered from an Apache camp. He would provide a witness, one of his own men. It would be enough. From that fabricated crime, a new piece of paper was born. Sheriff Shaw, his pen scratching with authority, drew up a warrant. It was posted on the board outside his office, next to notices for lost cattle and upcoming socials. The poster was crude, a hastily sketched approximation of a man with high cheekbones and a scar, but the words were sharp and clear. Wanted, Cade Cerolina, horse thief. A reward was offered for his capture, dead or alive. It was a significant sum, enough to make a desperate man reckless and a cruel man enthusiastic. The lead coin of the bullet had been given the value of gold. Evelyn Hart saw the poster on her way to the general store. The words seemed to vibrate with a vicious energy. Horse thief. It did not square with the man she had seen in the saloon, the man who had absorbed insults with a stillness that was anything but cowardly. Her mind, trained to find order and consistency, rejected the accusation. It felt like a poorly constructed sentence, a lie that did not parse. Later that day, her duty as the preacher's daughter sent her to the sheriff's office with a list of parishioners who had volunteered to repair the church roof. Shaw was not at his desk. A deputy took the list, grunting his thanks. As Evelyn turned to leave, her eyes fell upon a document lying on the corner of Shaw's desk. It was an official requisition for ammunition and supplies, authorized by a territorial magistrate whose signature she recognized. Judge Miller had visited her father often, and his signature was a flamboyant, almost illegible scrawl. The signature on this paper was different. It was neat, precise, and utterly without character. It was the signature of a man carefully copying a name he did not own. Without thinking, she remarked on it. She mentioned that Judge Miller's handwriting seemed to have improved greatly. The deputy looked up from his paperwork, his eyes narrowing. He told her she must be mistaken, when she gently insisted, pointing out the difference. His face hardened. He stood up, his bulk blocking the light from the door. He told her in a low voice that some things were not her concern. He said it was not proper for a lady to meddle in the official business of men. His tone was not just dismissive, it was a threat, a clear, sharp warning to look the other way. Evelyn left the office, the heat of the afternoon suddenly feeling cold on her skin. The false signature and the wanted poster were two parts of the same ugly story, and she was now an unwelcome witness to its telling. The sun was setting as she began her walk home, the sky a canvas of angry reds and bruised purples. She took a path that skirted the edge of town, a trail that wound through stands of mesquite and cholla cactus. She preferred the quiet of the desert to the charged atmosphere of the main street. But tonight, the quiet was different. It was watchful. 3 men stepped out from behind a jumble of red rocks, blocking her path. She recognized one of them from the saloon, the man who had first accosted Cade. With him was Hank Ravel. The third man was a stranger with a mean, pinched face. Ravel was the one who spoke, his voice polite in a way that made it more menacing. He tipped his hat. He said he hoped he was not disturbing her evening stroll. He told her they were just concerned citizens. They had heard she was asking questions at the sheriff's office. They had seen her looking at the wanted poster with a certain expression on her face. Ravel explained that Dust Mesa was a simple town. It was best not to complicate things. He suggested it would be healthier for everyone if she confined her attention to teaching children their letters and left the pursuit of justice to men better equipped for it. They did not touch her. They did not have to. They stood around her, a human cage, their presence a promise of violence. The smell of whiskey and unwashed sweat filled the air. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She could not speak, her throat tight with fear. Then a 4th man was there. He had not ridden up. He had not walked up. He had simply appeared, a figure of stillness materializing from the deepening shadows near the canyon wall. It was Cade. He stood 20 feet away, his expression unreadable in the fading light. He looked at the men surrounding Evelyn, and then his eyes met hers. Ravel's hand drifted toward his pistol. He had not expected this. He smiled, a thin, predatory curl of his lips. He remarked that it seemed the fugitive had come to them. This was perfect. A confrontation, a righteous shooting. He could claim the Apache had attacked the preacher's daughter. But Cade did not reach for his knife. He did not assume a fighting stance. He spoke, and his voice was calm, cutting through the tension. He told Evelyn to walk toward him. Slowly. Ravel's men shifted, unsure. This was not the script they had rehearsed. Cade's focus was absolute. He did not look at them. He looked only at Evelyn, his gaze a steady anchor in her sea of fear. She took a hesitant step, then another. The men let her pass, their bravado faltering in the face of his unnerving calm. When she reached his side, he turned, not away from the men, but at an angle, and began to walk. He told her to follow him. Ravel shouted for him to stop, that he was under arrest. Cade did not break his stride. He led Evelyn toward a narrow cleft in the rock face, an opening she had never noticed before. It was the entrance to a place the locals called Bone Slot, a winding, dry wash carved deep into the mesa. A shot rang out, the bullet whining off the rock near Cade's head. He did not flinch. He pushed Evelyn ahead of him into the narrow canyon, the walls rising up on either side of them like ancient, silent giants. Behind them, they could hear the clumsy sounds of pursuit, the scrape of boots on rock, the curses of Ravel and his men. But Cade moved with a silent, certain grace. He knew every twist, every turn, every pile of scree that might give way under a careless foot. He led her deeper into the earth's embrace, the sounds of their pursuers growing more distant, distorted by the echoing rock. He finally stopped in a small, hidden alcove, a hollow in the canyon wall shielded by a curtain of ancient, dry roots. The moon was rising, its silver light painting the top of the canyon walls. But down where they were, it was a world of deep shadow and shared silence. The only sounds were their own breathing and the distant cry of a coyote, a lonely, mournful call that seemed to be the very voice of the wilderness. Evelyn leaned against the rock, her body trembling with the aftermath of terror. She looked at Cade, at his silhouette in the gloom. He had saved her, but he was still a stranger, a man the whole town had marked as a monster. She could see the handle of the knife at his hip, a dark, menacing shape. He saw the direction of her gaze. He understood her fear was not only of the men who had hunted them, but also of him. He did something then that defied every story she had ever heard, every warning she had ever been given. He slowly drew the long knife from its sheath. The polished steel caught a faint glimmer of moonlight, a sliver of cold fire. Evelyn flinched, her breath catching in her throat, but he did not hold it as a weapon. He turned it in his hand and offered it to her, the worn leather hilt facing her. His voice was low, barely a whisper against the vast silence of the canyon. He said, "So you can see I do not bind you." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled deep in her soul. He was not just giving her his weapon, he was giving her his trust. He was making himself vulnerable to her, the very person he had just rescued. Her hand, still shaking, reached out and took the knife. The handle was smooth and warm from his grip. The blade was heavy, perfectly balanced, a tool made for survival in this hard land. Holding it, feeling its solid, undeniable reality in her palm, she felt her fear begin to recede, replaced by a new, bewildering emotion. It was the first time a man had ever offered her power instead of demanding her submission. In the heart of the dark canyon, with danger still echoing behind them, a fragile bridge of trust was being built, one small, genuine act at a time. They remained in the shadows of Bone Slot until the moon was high and the sounds of pursuit had long since faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. The knife felt heavy in Evelyn's hand, a weight of responsibility she had never imagined holding. It was a piece of him, a dangerous and intimate part, and he had given it to her freely. She looked at him, his face a landscape of shadows and moonlight, and saw not a fugitive, but the man who had walked calmly into a canyon while a bullet sang past his ear. Finally, she held the knife out to him, hilt first, just as he had offered it to her. Her hand was steady now. He took it, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting instant, a touch as dry and warm as the stone around them. He slid the blade back into its sheath in a single, fluid motion. The act felt like a question answered, a pact sealed without a word. He led her out of the canyon through a different egress, a steep, narrow trail that required them to climb. He moved ahead, testing each foothold, his hand occasionally reaching back to steady her. By the time they emerged onto the high mesa, the town of Dust Mesa was a scattering of faint yellow lights far below, a place that felt a world away. He did not lead her back toward it. He turned his face to the dark mass of the mountains. He told her there was something she needed to see, if she was willing. The truth of the matter did not live in the sheriff's office or on a wanted poster. It flowed from the earth, trusting the instinct that had bloomed in the canyon. She nodded and followed him into the high country. They walked for what felt like hours, the air growing cooler and thinner, scented with pine and dust. Cade moved with a tireless, ground-covering stride that spoke of a lifetime spent in these mountains. Evelyn, accustomed only to the flat, dusty streets of the town, found her lungs burning and her legs aching. But she refused to slow him down. To complain would be to betray the trust he had shown her. This was his world, and she was a guest in it. Just before dawn, when the eastern sky had softened to a bruised gray, he stopped. The sound was faint at first, a gentle, melodic murmur that grew louder as they approached. It was the sound of moving water. He led her through a final stand of gnarled juniper trees and into a small, secluded basin. There, bubbling up from a fissure in a bed of smooth, dark stones, was a spring. The water was so clear it was almost invisible, pooling into a basin of pure, cold life before spilling over and forming a small creek that vanished into the rocks below. This was Spring Knife, the lifeblood of the entire region. Wildflowers, impossibly vibrant in the parched landscape, grew in thick clusters along its banks. It was a place of profound peace, a sanctuary, and it had been violated. Cade did not need to point out the signs. Evelyn saw them immediately, her mind cataloging the evidence with the same precision she applied to a grammar lesson. First were the new wooden stakes, driven deep into the ground at regular intervals, their tops painted a garish orange. They were surveyor's markers, a cold, geometric imposition on the land's natural curves. Then she saw the wire. A roll of it, new and cruel with its sharp barbs, lay half-hidden in a thicket of scrub oak. It had not been strung yet, but its presence was an ugly promise of division, a tool to cut the land and its people apart. The final piece of evidence was the most sinister. Tucked away under a rocky overhang, shielded from casual view, were 3 large burlap sacks. They were stamped with the name of a freight company from a distant city. Cade sliced one open with his knife, and a fine, white powder spilled onto the ground. Lime. Evelyn knew what it was for. In small amounts, it could clarify water. In these quantities, dumped into the source of the spring, it would poison everything for miles downstream. The water would run milky and sick, killing the fish, sickening the animals, and making it undrinkable for any human. It was a weapon of thirst, a way to make the land itself uninhabitable. And the blame, as Cade quietly explained, would be easy to place on the people who had lived here for generations. It was a lie designed to curdle the very earth. He looked at the sacks, his face set like granite. The cold anger radiating from him was more frightening than any outburst. It was the anger of a man witnessing a sacrilege. Evelyn felt a corresponding surge of her own, a clean, sharp outrage that burned away the last of her fear. This was not a dispute over property. This was a calculated act of destruction, a plot to steal not just land, but life itself. From the spring, Cade led her to the small, hidden encampment where his people were living. It was not a grand village, just a collection of sturdy wickiups blended so perfectly into the landscape of rock and juniper that a stranger could pass by without ever seeing them. An elderly woman nodded to Cade as they entered, her eyes lingering on Evelyn with a neutral curiosity. He took her to a wickiup where a woman was grinding herbs on a flat stone. She looked up as they approached, and Evelyn saw a family resemblance in her high cheekbones and dark, intelligent eyes. This was Neela, Cade's cousin. Her husband had been killed 2 years before, another victim of the bounty hunters, and she now served her people as a healer, her hands skilled in the arts of mending and soothing. Neela's gaze was direct, assessing. She offered Evelyn a cup of water, a simple gesture of hospitality that felt profound in this place. At this time, sitting near the fire, painstakingly trying to shape a piece of scrap metal with a rock, was Toby, the boy from Evelyn's school. Seeing him here in this context startled her. He looked up, his face breaking into a wide, surprised grin. He proudly showed her his work, explaining his ambition to become a blacksmith, to make things that were useful and strong. Here, among his mother's people, he was not the quiet, out-of-place boy from the schoolroom, but a child with a clear sense of belonging and purpose. Neela watched her son with a mixture of pride and sorrow, and Evelyn understood that these were not the faceless savages of Riggs' propaganda. They were families, with hopes and griefs as real as her own. Evelyn knew then what she had to do. She could not fight Rigg with a gun or a knife, but she could fight him with the truth. When they returned to the edge of Dust Mesa under the cover of the next night, she did not go home. She went to the church and woke her father. Reverend Hart listened, his face etched with concern as she told him everything she had seen: the false signature, the confrontation on the trail, the stakes, the wire, the sacks of lime by the sacred spring. She spoke with a passion and certainty that he had never heard from her before. She was no longer just his daughter. She was a witness. She implored him to use his position, to use the church as a place of truth. She asked him to call a public meeting, a forum where she could present the evidence to the people of the town, where the truth could be brought into the light before Riggs' lies could poison them as surely as the lime would poison the water. Her father, a man who believed in the power of conscience, looked at the fire in his daughter's eyes and agreed. The meeting was set for the following evening. Word spread through the town like a grass fire, whispers of a special assembly at the church, of matters of grave importance to be discussed. There was a nervous energy in the air, a sense of impending confrontation. That night, a new terror was unleashed. A scream tore through the darkness, followed by the frantic ringing of a dinner bell. A glow appeared on the south side of town, an angry, flickering orange that painted the undersides of the clouds. It was a fire. The hay barn belonging to the Alvarez family, Mexican immigrants who ran a small freight business, was engulfed in flames. The whole town turned out, a chaotic mess of bucket brigades and panicked shouts. The dry wood of the barn burned with astonishing speed, a roaring inferno that threw sparks high into the night sky. By the time the fire was contained, the barn was a smoking ruin, and the Alvarez family's livelihood had turned to ash. Sheriff Deacon Shaw arrived, his face grim and authoritative in the firelight. He did not ask questions. He did not look for tracks or evidence. He moved through the crowd, his voice loud and clear, and announced that he had seen two figures running from the scene, heading north toward the spring knife range. He did not have to say the word. Apache. The accusation hung in the smoky air, heavy and poisonous. It was the perfect accelerant for the fear and prejudice Rigg had been so carefully cultivating. The people, their faces smudged with soot and fear, looked at one another. The whispers began immediately. The Apache had grown bold. They were not just stealing horses anymore. They were burning people out, bringing the terror of the wilderness right into the heart of the town. Evelyn stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart cold with a terrible certainty. This was not a random act of violence. It was a move in a deadly game, a calculated stroke designed to turn the town against the very people who were about to be judged. She looked at Shaw, at his calm, certain demeanor, and she knew. The men who set this fire were not Apache. They were the same kind of men who had cornered her on the trail, men who served a master more ruthless than any imagined savage. The public meeting she had called for, intended as a forum for truth, was now set to become a trial fueled by lies and fear. The air inside the church was hotter and more stifling than the air outside. Every pew was filled, and men stood 3 deep along the back wall, their faces pale and anxious in the flickering lamplight. The room smelled of sweat, dust, and the lingering, acrid scent of smoke that clung to everyone's clothes from the previous night's fire. It was a house of God, but tonight it felt like a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Reverend Hart stood at the pulpit, his Bible open but his eyes on the faces of his congregation. He spoke of peace, of Christian charity, of the need for reason to prevail over fear. But his words felt thin, a flimsy dam against the tide of anger that had been rising in Dust Mesa since the Alvarez barn had been turned to ash. The people had come not for a sermon, but for a verdict. When her father finished, Evelyn walked to the front of the church. She held no book, only a few folded papers in her hand. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but she forced her voice to be steady, clear, the same voice she used to teach children their letters. She was no longer just the preacher's daughter. She was a witness, and this was her testimony. She began with the document from Sheriff Shaw's office. She described the requisition for ammunition, and she described the signature of the territorial magistrate. She explained, simply and without embellishment, that it was not his signature. It was a forgery, a lie on an official paper. A low murmur went through the crowd. It was a small thing, but it was a crack in the foundation of authority. Then she spoke of the mountains. She described the beauty and the peace of the Spring Knife Basin. And then she described what she had seen there. She told them about the orange-tipped surveyor's stakes, a grid of ownership laid over a land that had never known it. She told them about the roll of new barbed wire waiting to fence off the water from its rightful users. Finally, she unfolded a small piece of burlap she had cut from one of the sacks and held it up. She told them about the lime, tons of it, hidden near the spring. She explained its purpose, how it would turn the water into a poison that would flow down from the mountains and sicken their own livestock, their own children. And she told them how easy it would be to blame the Apache for such a catastrophe. The silence that followed was heavy, uncertain. Her words were hard to believe, yet she spoke with such conviction that they were equally hard to dismiss. Before the whispers could turn to arguments, another man stood up. It was Dr. Wilson, a man trusted by everyone in town. He was a man of science, not sentiment, his diagnoses always delivered in a calm, factual tone. He addressed the crowd, his voice carrying the weight of his reputation. He confirmed that he had been one of the first to arrive at the Alvarez fire. He had examined the ground carefully before it was trampled by the bucket brigade. The tracks he found near the barn, he stated, were clear. They were made by horses wearing iron shoes. He paused, letting the information settle. Then he added, as a matter of simple fact, that the mountain Apache rode unshod ponies. Their horses' hooves were tough as stone from a life in the mountains. The men who set that fire, he concluded, were not Apache. The crowd stirred, a beast waking from a troubled sleep. Dr. Wilson's testimony was a stone dropped into the murky pond of their assumptions. It directly contradicted the sheriff's confident pronouncement at the scene of the fire. Men looked at Shaw, who stood near the door with his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of leather. Before the questions could erupt, Baron Rigg strode to the front, his expensive boots echoing on the wooden floor. He did not look at Evelyn or the doctor. He looked at the crowd, his face arranged in an expression of paternal concern. He did not try to refute their evidence. He waved it away as if it were a troublesome fly. He called Evelyn a well-meaning but naive young woman, someone whose tender heart was not equipped to understand the harsh realities of progress. He spoke to them in the language he knew they understood best, the language of money and fear. He talked about the future of Dust Mesa. He painted a picture of a bustling town, a hub of commerce with a new, direct wagon road bringing goods and prosperity. He promised jobs, security, a town where their wives and children could be safe. But, he said, his voice dropping to a confidential rumble, progress had a price. The future could not be built on sentiment. The Apache, he argued, were a relic of the past, an obstacle to the bright future that was within their grasp. He was offering them a simple, clear choice, a wagon road to prosperity, or a sentimental attachment to a people who stood in its way. His words were potent. He was offering them a simple solution to their complex fears, a scapegoat for their anxieties about the drought, the economy, and the unforgiving land itself. The mood in the church shifted again. The doubt planted by Evelyn and the doctor began to wither under the heat of Riggs' promises. A man in the back shouted his agreement, and a few others joined in. Just as the tide seemed to have turned decisively in Riggs' favor, a woman's voice, quiet but clear, cut through the noise. "He lies." All heads turned. Neela stood near the back of the church. She had come with Cade and a few others from their camp, standing quietly, observing. Now, she walked forward, moving with a contained grace that commanded attention. She stopped beside Evelyn, facing the crowd, her face a portrait of profound, settled grief. She did not speak of the fire, or the water, or the forged papers. She spoke of her husband. She told the people of Dust Mesa how he had died 2 years ago. She reminded them of the official story they had all been told, that he had been killed while attempting to raid a supply wagon. Then she told them the truth. He had been hunting, alone, when he was ambushed. He was not killed in a fight. He was executed. "The men who killed him," she said, her voice trembling but unbroken, "were not defending property. They were harvesting a trophy. They were led by a man named Hank Ravel." She looked directly at Rigg. "The same man you brought to this town 2 days ago." A gasp went through the room. Neela's testimony was not about abstract concepts like progress or property rights. It was a story of a husband, a father, a man murdered not for what he did, but for what he was. Her personal grief was more powerful than all of Riggs' grand promises. It was a truth that could be felt in the heart, not just weighed in the mind. The room exploded into chaos. The crowd was no longer a single entity. It was a fractured collection of angry, frightened, and confused individuals. Shouts and accusations flew from every corner. Men were on their feet, shaking their fists, some at Rigg, some at the sheriff, some at the silent Apache standing at the back. Sheriff Shaw saw his authority and Riggs' entire plan dissolving in the anarchy. He made his decision. He raised his hand, a sharp, commanding gesture to the 3 deputies he had positioned by the doors. "This is an unlawful assembly," he bellowed, his voice cracking like a whip. "It's over." His eyes found Cade, who had not moved from his spot, a figure of absolute stillness in the swirling chaos. Shaw pointed a trembling finger at him. "Arrest that man for horse theft and for inciting this riot." The deputies moved, their rifles coming up. They were professionals, their movements economical and brutal. They began to push their way through the crowd, using the barrels of their guns to clear a path. The townsfolk fell back before them, their arguments dying in their throats, replaced by a new, more immediate fear. One of the deputies reached the open space at the front and leveled his rifle directly at Cade's chest. The small, dark hole of the barrel seemed to absorb all the light in the room. In that instant, Evelyn moved. It was not a decision, not a thought. It was an instinct, a primal, protective urge that overrode every lesson in caution and propriety she had ever learned. She launched herself forward, placing her body directly in the path of the gun. She stood with her back to Cade, her arms slightly raised, a small, trembling shield of flesh and bone against the cold, hard certainty of the rifle. The deputy stared at her, his finger frozen on the trigger, his face a mask of disbelief. Behind her, Evelyn could feel the great wooden cross that hung on the wall, its shadow falling over her like a heavy cloak. She was terrified, but she did not move. To believe in what was right, she had just discovered, meant being willing to stand in the path of the bullet. The chaos in the church became a single, sharp point of focus: the deputy's rifle, Evelyn's body, and the silent man behind her. For a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity. No one moved. The raw courage of her act, so unexpected from the preacher's quiet daughter, stunned the room into a fragile silence. It was Reverend Hart who broke the spell. He moved to his daughter's side, his face a mask of fear and paternal fury, placing a hand on her shoulder. Sheriff Shaw, seeing his authority challenged by a woman and a preacher, felt a surge of rage. He shoved his way forward and grabbed Evelyn's arm, pulling her roughly aside. He told her she was interfering with the law. The moment she was clear, 2 deputies seized Cade. They were quick and brutal, twisting his arms behind his back and binding his wrists with a leather thong. Cade did not fight them. To resist here, in this room full of panic, would only lead to a massacre. He met Evelyn's terrified gaze with a look of calm reassurance before they pushed him out the church doors and into the night. They did not put him in the town jail. Shaw knew that would be a focal point for the newly divided town. Instead, 3 deputies were tasked with taking him immediately to the territorial prison, a 2-day ride away. They pushed him onto a horse, his hands tied to the saddle horn, and rode out of Dust Mesa without delay, leaving the town to argue and fester in their wake. They rode hard through the night, pushing into the broken land that led to the high mountains. The deputies were tense, their victory in the church soured by the open descent they had witnessed. They spoke little, their silence punctuated by the rhythmic clatter of hooves on stone. Cade remained silent as well, his body moving with the horse, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape even in the deep dark. He was a prisoner, but his mind was free, measuring the miles, noting the turns, feeling the subtle shifts in the wind that told him exactly where they were. Just after dawn, they began their ascent into the foothills, entering a landscape of steep ravines and treacherous switchbacks. The lead deputy, a man named Calloway, chose a trail he thought was a shortcut, a path that was little more than a goat track clinging to the side of a sheer cliff. It was a mistake. This was Cade's land. He knew every rock, every twisted tree, every place a man could find a foothold or lose one. He waited for a section of the trail that was barely wide enough for a single horse, with a sheer drop on one side and a wall of rock on the other. With a sudden, powerful twist of his body and a sharp kick, he sent his horse sideways into the deputy's mount behind him. The animal shrieked and staggered, its rider cursing as he fought to control it on the narrow ledge. In that moment of confusion, Cade used the slack in his bonds to throw himself from the saddle, not toward the deadly drop, but toward the rock face. He hit the stone and scrambled upward, his bound hands finding holds a settler would never have seen. He moved with the speed and agility of a mountain cat. The deputies, trapped in single file on the narrow path, shouted in surprise and anger. Calloway, the man in the lead, turned his horse clumsily, trying to get a clear shot, but Cade was already disappearing into a nearly invisible crevice in the rock. It was the entrance to a path known to only a few Apache hunters, Wolf's Ladder. It was not a trail for horses or for men burdened by fear. It was a vertical maze of handholds and footholds, a secret staircase up the mountain's spine. The deputies dismounted, their heavy boots slipping on the loose shale. They fired their rifles, the bullets ricocheting wildly, the echoes of the shots a frantic, useless noise against the mountain silence. Cade climbed. He moved through the mountain, not just over it. He led them a chase through the labyrinth of stone, always staying just out of sight. He did not seek to harm them, only to delay and disorient them. At a narrow pass, he triggered a small rock slide, nothing lethal, but enough to block the trail and force them to backtrack. Later, using a length of vine, he snagged the rifle from the last deputy's hands, disarming him without ever showing his face. He led them in circles until their frustration turned to exhaustion and their water canteens ran low. By midday, they were hopelessly lost, their prisoner long gone. They had been thoroughly, and non-lethally, defeated. Cade had disabled their pursuit without firing a shot, without drawing his knife. He had simply used their own ignorance of the land against them. News of the escape reached Dust Mesa before the deputies themselves, carried by a prospector who had seen the riderless horse. The town was a hive of rumors. Shaw declared Cade a dangerous killer, a savage who had overwhelmed 3 armed men. They used the story to stoke the flames of fear, claiming no one was safe. Evelyn heard the news and felt not fear, but a surge of hope. She knew Cade was alive. She also knew he would need help. She went to Neela's small house at the edge of town and found her packing herbs into small deerskin pouches. Toby sat nearby, his face a mask of worry. Evelyn explained what she knew, and Neela understood immediately. Cade would be hurt, if not from the deputies, then from the escape itself. She gave Evelyn a bundle of bandages and a salve made from pine resin and yarrow, a powerful healer of wounds. Evelyn and Toby left town that evening, moving under the cover of dusk. Toby, with the uncanny directional sense of his ancestors, led her unerringly into the mountains, following paths that were invisible to her untrained eyes. They moved in silence, two small figures against the vast, dark landscape, carrying their secret offering of aid. They found Cade in a place called Black Kettle Cave, a deep, dry hollow hidden behind a waterfall that had long ago run dry. A small, smokeless fire of juniper wood cast a warm glow on the stone walls, which were dark with the soot of generations of campfires. The air smelled of pine resin and clean, dry earth. Cade sat by the fire, tending to a long, raw scrape along his arm. He looked up as they entered, his expression softening when he saw them. He accepted the medicine from Evelyn with a quiet nod of thanks, allowing her to clean the wound and apply Neela's salve. Her touch was gentle, professional, the same careful attention she gave to a child's scraped knee. They worked in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind in the pines outside. When she was finished, Toby, who had been watching with wide, serious eyes, offered Cade a small, perfectly carved bird made from a piece of driftwood. It was a gift of respect, a child's acknowledgement of a hero's return. Cade took the bird and held it in his palm, studying its delicate lines. Then he looked at Evelyn, and for the first time, she saw the walls behind his eyes crumble. The stoic warrior, the silent scout, vanished, replaced by a man carrying a weight too heavy to bear alone. He spoke, his voice low and rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He said he was tired. Tired of running. Tired of fighting. Tired of living by hatred. He confessed that a part of him on that trail had wanted to turn back, to find the deputies and finish it, to answer their violence with his own. But he said he had thought of her, standing in front of that rifle, and he had chosen a different path. It was a raw, honest confession, an admission of vulnerability that was more powerful than any act of strength. Their quiet sanctuary was shattered 2 days later. Neela came to the cave, her face grim. She brought food, but she also brought terrible news. Rig had not been idle. He had used the escape and the fire to whip the town into a frenzy of fear. He had convened a citizens' committee and, with Shaw's legal blessing, had signed a civil resolution. The document declared the mountain Apache a threat to public safety and ordered their immediate removal from the Spring Knife Range. They had 5 days to abandon their ancestral homes and relocate to a barren reservation 100 miles to the south. It was a death sentence disguised as a legal document. Cade listened to the news, the muscle in his jaw tightening. His first instinct was to fight, to gather his people and meet this paper decree with arrows and rifles. It was the old way, the path of righteous anger and inevitable bloodshed. But as he looked at Evelyn, at her pale, determined face, another thought took hold. His exhaustion with hatred was not just a passing feeling, it was a choice. He would not run, and he would not fight their way. Rig and Shaw built their power on lies and paper. He would tear it down with the truth. He told them he would not lead his people into a futile war. Instead, he would find the proof that would undo Rig completely. The forged signature was a start, but it was not enough. A man like Rig, a man building an empire, would have ledgers. He would have contracts. He would have sent and received telegraph messages. His greed would have left a trail, a paper trail that could be followed all the way back to its corrupt source. Evelyn's eyes lit up. She saw the new path immediately. It was a fight she was equipped for. She said that Rig communicated with his partners in other territories, that the telegraph office was his lifeline. The messages, the financial arrangements, the orders he gave, they would all pass through that small, humming office. The telegraph key, she realized, could be a weapon far more powerful than any rifle. While Cade knew the mountains, she knew the world of words and numbers, of evidence and proof. The courage to find the truth, she now understood, was only the first step. The real strength lay in having the courage to follow it to its end. The plan they formed in the dry, still air of the cave was one of quiet audacity. They would not attack the telegraph office in Dust Mesa. It was too central, too well guarded, a spider at the center of a web. But Evelyn, whose mind held a map of the territory's infrastructure, knew of another point of vulnerability. 20 miles east, where the railroad tracks made a long, sweeping curve before the steep grade into the mountains, was a small relay and switching station called Red Switch. It was a lonely outpost, a single wooden shack and a water tower, manned by one, often sleeping, operator. It was a nerve ending, not the brain, but all messages passed through it. They set out on the third night of the 5-day ultimatum, a trio of ghosts moving through a landscape of black and silver. Cade led them, his steps making no more sound than a falling leaf. Evelyn followed, her city shoes wholly inadequate for the rocky terrain, but her determination a fire in her chest. And behind her, light and silent, came Toby, carrying a small leather tool roll he had assembled from scraps, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a boy's thirst for adventure. Red Switch was a bleak silhouette against the star-dusted sky. A single yellow lamp burned in its window. As they drew closer, they could hear the faint, rhythmic clicking of the relay, a mechanical heartbeat in the vast silence. Cade held up a hand, and they melted into the shadows of the water tower. He had seen the guard, a single man sitting in a chair tilted against the station wall, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the ground beside him. Cade whispered his instructions. He would draw the man away. Evelyn and Toby were to get inside, get the copies, and get out. He gave Toby a small, flat stone. When Cade was in position, he would make the call of a screech owl, a sound so common in these hills it would not alarm the man, but it would be their signal. He vanished into the darkness. Minutes later, the owl call, eerie and perfect, drifted through the night air. Evelyn's heart leaped. A moment later, a sharp clatter came from a rocky outcrop 100 yards down the tracks. The guard startled awake, cursing. He picked up his rifle and lumbered off to investigate the noise, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. The moment he was gone, they ran, their feet silent on the dusty ground. The door was locked, as they had expected. Cade had told them this would be Toby's task. Evelyn looked at the boy, a flicker of doubt in her mind. He was so small, but Toby's eyes were bright with purpose. He studied the building for a moment, then pointed to a small ventilation hatch high on the back wall, used for the telegraph's battery fumes. It was barely a foot square. Evelyn gave him a boost, his small, wiry body scrambling up the rough plank wall. He wriggled through the opening and dropped silently to the floor inside. A moment later, the bolt on the back door scraped open. The air inside was thick with the sharp, metallic smell of ozone and stale cigar smoke. The telegraph machine chattered on its table, an endless stream of coded conversation passing through its brass fittings. Evelyn went to it immediately, her fear replaced by a focused intensity. She knew how these machines worked. Every message, incoming and outgoing, was recorded on a long, thin ribbon of paper, a tape that spooled into a basket on the floor. While she began the painstaking task of unspooling the tape and scanning it for Riggs' name or his known associates, Toby got to work on his part of the plan. To copy the messages, Evelyn would need to use the key, sending a query down the line. But that would alert the operator at the next station. Cade had explained that they needed to cut the line, but not in a way that would be obvious. Toby, who had a natural gift for understanding how things fit together, had an idea. He opened the battery cabinet. Following a diagram he had once seen in a discarded technical journal, he located the main fuse. With a pair of wooden tongs from his tool roll, he carefully eased the small glass cylinder from its clips. The chattering of the relay instantly stopped. The line was dead, but not broken. To any operator down the line, it would seem like a momentary power failure, not sabotage. In the sudden, heavy silence. Another sound became apparent. It was a low, deep rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, the night train, heading west. Its sound was a clock, ticking down the limited time they had. Evelyn worked faster, her fingers flying over the paper ribbon. She found it. A series of messages from the past week, sent to a munitions supplier in another territory. The supplier was confirming a large, private order for rifles and ammunition, an order far too large for a simple rancher. Then she found another set of messages, these ones more cryptic, sent between Rig and an unknown party. They spoke of a land survey, of a water rights claim that needed to be vacated. One message was chillingly direct. It mentioned a rancher named Peterson, a man who owned a small but well-watered piece of land that stood in the way of Rig's proposed cattle trail. The telegram read, "Peterson problem must be solved permanently. Stop offer stands. Stop confirm by Friday." It was a contract for a murder, spelled out in the cold, efficient language of the telegraph. Her hands trembling, she began to copy the messages onto a fresh sheet of paper, her pencil scratching furiously. She copied the dates, the times, the routing codes. It was the proof Kate had been looking for, the paper trail that led directly to the dark heart of Rig's empire. As she finished the last line, the train's rumble had grown to a ground-shaking roar, its headlamp a blazing eye cutting through the darkness. It was time to go. Toby. His face smudged, but triumphant, carefully replaced the fuse. The relay immediately began to chatter again, picking up the thread of its endless conversation as if nothing had happened. They slipped out the back door, leaving no trace of their intrusion, and ran for the cover of a deep irrigation ditch that ran alongside the tracks. They thought they were safe. They had the evidence. They had been ghosts. But as they climbed out of the ditch and started back towards the mountains, a voice cut through the night, a voice as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. "That's far enough." Hank Ravel stepped out from behind a stand of cottonwood trees. He was not alone. 2 of his men were with him, their rifles held at the ready. Ravel held a pistol, and it was aimed not at Cade, who had materialized from the shadows to stand beside them, but at Evelyn. Ravel smiled, a humorless expression. He told them he had been tracking Cade for days. He knew the Apache would not simply run, he knew he would fight back. He had expected something like this. He commended them on their cleverness. Cade moved slightly, placing himself between Ravel and Evelyn. Ravel's smile widened. He told Cade not to bother. He was not going to shoot them. Not yet. Killing them would be messy, but capturing them, here, in the act of sabotaging the telegraph station, capturing them with stolen messages in their possession, that was a story the people of Dust Mesa would believe. They would be seen as saboteurs, Apache spies trying to cut the town off from the outside world. It was a far better ending to his story. It would justify everything. He wanted them alive. The train was closer now, its whistle screaming as it approached the switch. The ground vibrated beneath their feet in the chaos of the train's passage. Cade saw his chance. It was not much of a chance, but it was the only one they had. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes conveying a silent, urgent command. He glanced behind them, toward a low wooden bridge that crossed a wide, stone-lined overflow channel for the water tower. The recent rains had filled it, and the water was running fast and deep. The train was upon them, a deafening thunder of steel and steam. In the instant that Ravel and his men were blinded and deafened by its passage, Cade grabbed Evelyn's hand. "Jump!" he yelled over the roar. He pulled her into a run, straight for the bridge. They heard shouts behind them, but the noise of the train swallowed the sounds. They reached the edge of the bridge. It was a 10-foot drop to the churning water below. For a second, Evelyn hesitated, her mind recoiling from the cold, black water. Cade did not give her time to think. He put his arm around her waist and leaped, pulling her with him into the abyss. The shock of the cold water stole her breath. It was a violent, churning chaos that tumbled them over and over. Cade's grip was like iron, holding onto her, fighting the current. He surfaced, pulling her head above the water. and swam with powerful strokes for the far bank, which was overgrown with a thick, high wall of reeds. They crashed through the reeds and collapsed onto the muddy bank, gasping for air, their bodies soaked and shivering. Behind them, they could hear Ravel's men shouting in frustration, their lanterns playing over the surface of the water. They had vanished. Cade pulled her deeper into the reeds until they were completely hidden from view. They lay in the cold mud, water dripping from their hair and clothes, their bodies pressed together for warmth. They could hear the men searching, their boots squelching in the mud just feet from their hiding place. Evelyn held her breath, her cheek pressed against the rough, wet fabric of Cade's shirt. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her own frantic, rabbit-like pulse. In the darkness, surrounded by enemies, they were bound together by a shared secret and a shared, desperate hope for survival. They stayed hidden in the cold, wet reeds for what felt like hours, listening as the lanterns of Ravel's men bobbed and weaved in the darkness. The shouts grew more distant, more frustrated, until finally they faded altogether, swallowed by the vast, uncaring night. Only then did Cade move. He helped Evelyn to her feet, their clothes heavy and dripping, their bodies shivering uncontrollably in the damp air. The journey back to the mountains was a grueling ordeal. They were soaked to the bone, and a cold wind had picked up, cutting through their wet clothes with relentless efficiency. Every step was an effort of will. During the chaotic leap from the bridge, a piece of floating debris had struck Cade high on the shoulder, and with every movement, a dull, throbbing pain intensified. He ignored it, his focus entirely on getting Evelyn to safety. They reached the hidden encampment near Springknife just as the first pale, gray light of dawn began to silhouette the eastern peaks. A fine, persistent drizzle had begun to fall, turning the world into a landscape of muted grays and greens. Neela saw them coming, and her face, usually so composed, tightened with alarm. She quickly led them to a small, temporary shelter, a simple lean-to made of canvas stretched over a frame of juniper branches. It was not much, but it was dry. Inside, a small fire was already burning in a shallow pit, its smoke mingling with the scent of damp earth and pine. Neela gave them thick wool blankets and hot, bitter tea brewed from mountain herbs. The warmth seeped into their chilled bodies, a slow, welcome miracle. While Evelyn huddled by the fire, her body still trembling, Neela examined Cade's shoulder. The fabric of his shirt was torn, and beneath it was a dark, ugly bruise and a long, shallow gash that was still sluggishly bleeding. Nyla cleaned the wound with a practiced hand, her touch firm but gentle. She told Evelyn what needed to be done, instructing her to keep the bandage clean and tight. Then she left them, giving them the privacy of the small shelter. A quiet acknowledgement that what they needed now was not medicine, but peace. The rain pattered softly on the canvas roof, a steady, rhythmic drumming that seemed to count the seconds. It was a sound of isolation, a curtain of water that cut them off from the world of pursuit and violence. Evelyn, her own clothes steaming dry in the heat of the fire, moved closer to Cade. She took the clean linen bandages Neela had left and began to dress his wound. He sat perfectly still, his back to her, the firelight playing over the strong muscles of his shoulders and the faint, old scars that mapped his history. Her fingers, usually so steady when holding a piece of chalk or a pencil, trembled slightly as she worked. This was a different kind of mending. She was touching the reality of the violence he had absorbed on her behalf. The proximity was intimate, a silent space filled only by the sound of the rain and their own soft breathing. As she carefully tied the final knot, her hand lingered for a moment on the warmth of his skin. She thought of the journey she had been on, not just the physical one through canyons and mountains, but the one that had taken her from the ordered certainty of her schoolroom to this rainy, desperate sanctuary. She thought of the women in town, their whispers and judgments, their carefully constructed lives built on fear of the unknown. And she thought of herself, the woman she had been, a person who had looked at this man and seen only the dangerous reputation that preceded him. Her voice, when she spoke, was a whisper, a thought given breath, not meant for him so much as for the quiet space between them. She was reflecting on the ironies of her world, on the blindness of her own community. Nobody desired to be his wife, she murmured, the words a soft counterpoint to the drumming of the rain. She paused, the full weight of her own transformation settling upon her. Until the Virgin realized the mountain Apache's heart beat softly for love. The words hung in the warm, smoky air. It was a confession. She was admitting to her own past blindness, her own place among the fearful. She was the Virgin, not just in body, but in the innocence of her untested principles, in the sheltered nature of her heart. She felt a flush of shame and a deeper, more profound sense of release. She had finally spoken the truth of her own heart's journey. She moved to sit facing him, pulling the rough wool blanket around her shoulders. She looked at the fire, unable to meet his eyes. "I was afraid," she said, her voice still quiet. "For so long, I kept my heart locked away. I was so afraid of what people would say, of the gossip, of being seen as different. I thought that safety was the most important thing." Cade was silent for a long time. He watched her, his dark eyes seeming to absorb the firelight, reflecting its warmth. He had heard the truth in her whispered words, the title the town had given him, and the new one she had discovered for herself. When he finally spoke, his voice was as quiet and steady as the rain. "We do not own each other," he said. "We choose each other." The words were simple, but they resonated with a power that shook her to her core. In her world, marriage was about property, about contracts, about a woman being given from one man to another. But he spoke of a different world, a different kind of bond, a choice, a free and mutual selection, an act of will, not of possession. It was the most beautiful and liberating idea she had ever heard. He reached out and took her hand. His was rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. He pulled her closer, and she went without hesitation, leaning against his good shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, and they sat in silence. Two survivors sharing a single space of warmth while the world outside grew colder and wetter. It was not a passionate embrace, but one of profound, peaceful intimacy, a closeness of spirit, not just of bodies. The soft drumming of the rain and the steady crackle of the fire seemed to create a space for memories to surface. It was he who spoke first, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He told her about his mother, a woman who knew the songs of every plant and could find water in the driest of lands. He spoke of how she had been taken by a sickness that had swept through their camp, a sickness brought by settlers. He spoke of his older brother, a fierce and joyful warrior who had been killed in a skirmish, his life traded for a piece of land that no one truly owned. His grief was an old, smooth stone, its sharp edges worn away by time, but its weight was still there, a permanent part of him. Hearing his story, Evelyn felt her own guarded past begin to open. She told him about her own mother, a woman she had never known, a woman who had died giving birth to her. She spoke of growing up in the shadow of that loss, of her father's quiet, constant grief, of feeling like a replacement for a ghost she could never live up to. She explained how that loss had shaped her, how it had made her seek order and certainty in a world that had begun with a profound and painful disorder. It was why she had built her walls so high, to protect a heart that had been broken before it had ever had a chance to fully form. They shared their histories, their foundational losses. In the quiet shelter, their words like smoke curling up into the damp air. The distance between the preacher's daughter and the Apache warrior dissolved, leaving only two people who understood the landscape of grief. As the rain began to subside, replaced by a thick, wet mist, their shared past gave way to their shared future. The weight of their responsibility returned. The copied telegrams, wrapped in oilcloth, were a heavy promise in Evelyn's satchel. She knew what she had to do, what they had to do. "My father," she said, her voice stronger now, filled with a new resolve. He will demand a public hearing. He has that right. He will not let Shaw and Rigg simply issue a decree. We will present the evidence. We will not let them drive your people from their homes." Cade looked at her. His eyes filled with a deep, quiet gratitude that was more eloquent than any words of thanks. He nodded. "We will not abandon them," he said. It was a simple statement, but it was a vow. A commitment made not just to each other, but to the community that depended on them. They were no longer two separate individuals fighting their own battles. They were partners, their causes, their futures, now inextricably intertwined. The choice he had spoken of had been made. The heart of Dust Mesa was its market square, a wide, hard-packed expanse of dirt that served as a place for commerce, gossip, and, on this day, a reckoning. Reverend Hart had forced the issue, invoking a territorial statute that allowed citizens to demand a public hearing on matters of imminent public threat. Faced with a town that was now openly fractured, Sheriff Shaw had no choice but to comply. He stood on a hastily erected wooden platform, his face a thunderous mask, a man trying to project authority he no longer fully possessed. The entire town was there, a sea of anxious faces under the harsh, unforgiving sun. They were not inside a church now, sheltered by walls of faith. They were in the open, exposed, and the mood was as brittle as sun-baked clay. On one side of the square stood Baron Rigg and a handful of his hired men, including the lean, watchful figure of Hank Revell. On the other stood a small, quiet group of mountain Apache, with Neela at their head, in the middle. A volatile mixture of ranchers, storekeepers, and drifters shifted restlessly, their allegiances uncertain. Evelyn Hart walked onto the platform, the oilcloth-wrapped papers in her hand. Cade stood at the foot of the platform, not as a defendant, but as a silent witness, his presence a calm and steady anchor in the swirling currents of hostility. Evelyn's voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was the clear, precise voice of a teacher, laying out facts for all to see. She unwrapped the papers, the copies of the telegraph messages. She read the first one, the order for a shipment of rifles and ammunition, a private arsenal for a man who claimed to be a simple rancher. A murmur went through the crowd. This was not the act of a man seeking peace. Then she read the second set of messages, the ones concerning the rancher Peterson. She read the cold, coded language of conspiracy, and then she read the final, damning line, "Peterson problem must be solved permanently." She let the words hang in the hot, still air. It was no longer about water rights or progress. It was about a plot to commit murder. Rigg bellowed that it was a trick, that the papers were forgeries, lies concocted by a hysterical woman and a wanted savage, but his voice had a new, sharp edge of panic in it. Reverend Hart called Dr. Wilson to the platform. The doctor explained to the crowd that 2 nights prior, Evelyn had come to his office and given him the sealed oilcloth package. He had locked it in his medical safe. He testified that he had just now, in front of the Reverend and 2 other witnesses, retrieved the package and confirmed that its seal was unbroken. The papers had not been tampered with. He could not speak to their origin, but he could attest to their integrity since they came into his possession. Then, to everyone's surprise, young Toby was lifted onto the platform by Cade. The boy was frightened, but he stood straight and held up a piece of slate. On it, he had drawn a simple, clear diagram of the inside of the Red Switch telegraph station. With a quiet, piping voice, he explained how the fuse in the battery cabinet worked. He showed how it could be removed to silence the line without breaking it, a temporary interruption that would go unnoticed. His technical explanation, so simple and logical, was more convincing than any adult's oath. It made the story real, tangible. It was the truth, spoken with the unadorned clarity of a child. The crowd began to turn. The evidence was too specific, too interlocking: the forged signature, the iron horseshoes at the fire, the plot to poison the spring, and now this, a murder for hire spelled out in black and white. Men who had been swayed by Rigg's promises of prosperity now looked at him with open suspicion. They saw a man whose ambition had no limits, a man who would burn and kill to get what he wanted. Baron Rigg saw it too. He saw his power, built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, crumbling to dust before his eyes. His face was purple with rage and fear. His empire was collapsing. In his panic, he looked to the one tool he had left, the one solution he had always relied upon: violence. His eyes met Hank Ravel's, and he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the signal Ravel needed. His job was not to win an argument, but to end one. He drew his pistol, not with the flash of a gunslinger, but with the efficient, deadly speed of an executioner. He did not aim at Evelyn on the platform. He aimed into the crowd, firing a single shot into the air. Panic erupted. The crowd screamed and surged, a terrified human wave. In that instant of chaos, Ravel's true purpose became clear. He was creating a diversion, a bloody riot that would allow Rigg to escape and discredit the entire hearing. His second shot was not aimed at the sky. It was aimed at the Alvarez family, who stood frozen in terror near the front. Cade moved. He did not draw his knife. He did not reach for a weapon. He saw Ravel's gun swing toward the Alvarez's small daughter, who had tripped and fallen in the stampede. In a blur of motion, Cade launched himself forward, covering the child's small body with his own just as Ravel fired. The bullet tore through the flesh of Cade's left shoulder, a searing, white-hot pain. The impact threw him forward, but he did not cry out. He curled himself tighter around the terrified child, making his body a shield. The crowd, even in its panic, saw the act. They saw the wanted man, the savage, throw himself in front of a bullet to save a child. And then they saw Ravel, his face a cold mask of professional detachment, raise his pistol again, preparing to shoot Cade in the back as he lay wounded on the ground. It was an act of cowardice so profound, so contrary to any code of honor, that it shocked the chaos into a moment of sudden, terrible clarity. The people of Dust Mesa stopped running. They turned and saw the truth of the man Rigg had hired. And then a new sound, a deep, deafening roar echoed across the square. It was not the crack of a pistol. It was the blast of a scattergun. From the doorway of the copper lantern, May stood with the heavy weapon braced against her hip, smoke curling from its twin barrels. She had seen the whole thing from her saloon, and her face, usually a mask of weary cynicism, was set in a look of cold, righteous fury. Hank Ravel staggered, a look of surprise on his face. He dropped his pistol, clutched at his chest, and fell to the dirt. His reign of terror ended by the woman who served whiskey to his victims. In the stunning silence that followed, Rigg made his move. He bolted, running from the platform, shoving people out of his way in a desperate bid for freedom. At the same time, the crowd turned on Sheriff Shaw, a big blacksmith, his face grim with anger, stepped forward and ripped the tin star from Shaw's chest. The sheriff, his face ashen, did not resist. His authority was gone, vanished in the smoke of Ravel's gun and the roar of May's shotgun. Rigg was running for his horse, but the people of Dust Mesa were running too. They were no longer a mob, they were a posse, their fear burned away by a collective, cleansing anger. They pursued him, their shouts echoing through the street. Cade, his arm bleeding freely, got to his feet and joined the chase, his face a grim mask of determination. They cornered Rigg at the edge of town, at a place called Devil's Shelf, a high, rocky bluff that dropped 100 feet to a dry, boulder-strewn wash. He was trapped, his horse's reins tangled, his face a grotesque caricature of terror. He was a king without a kingdom, a wolf without a pack. The crowd surged forward, their anger at its peak. They would have torn him apart. But Cade pushed his way to the front. He faced the man who had put a price on his head, who had tried to destroy his people and murder his friends. He had every right to kill him. Every man in that crowd would have understood. But Cade did not draw his knife. He took a rope from a nearby saddle and, with swift, efficient motions, tied Rigg's hands behind his back. He was choosing law, not vengeance. He was proving himself to be the better man, not by his strength, but by his restraint. Rigg, bound and helpless, finally broke. He screamed, his voice raw with impotent rage. "It's my land, my water. The Indians are stealing it from us. From you." He searched the faces of the crowd, looking for the fear and hatred he had always been able to manipulate. But he found nothing. The people of Dust Mesa stood in silence, their faces hard and knowing. They had seen the telegrams. They had heard the child's testimony. They had seen a good man shot in the back. Riggs' words were hollow, the last pathetic lies of a dethroned tyrant. Their silence was his verdict. It was the sound of a community that had finally and irrevocably chosen the truth. The dust settled slowly at Devil's Shelf, on the bound form of Baron Rigg and on the silent, watching faces of the people of Dust Mesa. The violent fever that had gripped the town had broken, leaving behind a profound and weary quiet. There was no celebration, no triumphant cheers, only the shared, sobering knowledge of how close they had all come to tearing themselves apart. 2 days later, a territorial marshal rode into town, a hard, quiet man with a sun-scorched face and eyes that had seen everything. He listened to the testimony of the reverend, the doctor, and a dozen other citizens. He took custody of the copies of the telegraphs and of the bound and sullen Baron Rigg. He formally stripped Deacon Shaw of his office, placing him under arrest to face federal charges of conspiracy and corruption. Rigg and Shaw were led away in shackles, their departure marking the end of an era of fear and the beginning of a deeply uncertain peace. With the law in disarray, the town's leading citizens, including Reverend Hart and Dr. Wilson, formed a provisional council. Their first order of business was to establish a new legal authority. The choice was obvious. They called a public meeting, and in front of the entire town, they offered the position of deputy sheriff to Cade Cerolina. A ripple of approval went through the crowd. It was a fitting gesture, a way to right a profound wrong. But Cade, his arm now clean and bandaged in a sling, stepped forward and quietly, respectfully, refused the offer. He looked at the faces before him, at the men and women he had fought alongside and against. He told them that a tin star was just another way of drawing a line between people. Dust Mesa did not need another enforcer, another man with a gun to compel obedience. It needed something else. He was a hunter and a scout, he explained, not a lawman. His skills were for finding paths, not for building cages. His refusal was a quiet shock. But before the council could argue, Evelyn spoke. She stood beside Cade, her voice clear and strong. She said that Cade was right. The problem had never been a lack of law, but a lack of justice. And justice, she argued, was not something that could be imposed by a single man with a badge. It had to be built, day by day, by the community itself. She proposed something new, not an office, but a place, a central point in the town that was not about law or commerce, but about life, a place of sharing. The idea, abstract at first, began to take shape as others joined in. Dr. Wilson spoke up, saying the town needed a reliable place for medicines and healing, a place where knowledge could be shared freely. Neela, standing with her people, nodded in agreement. She said she would contribute her knowledge of herbs and remedies, the healing arts of the mountain Apache, for anyone who needed them. May, the owner of the copper lantern, who had stood silently at the back, a shotgun leaning against the wall behind her bar ever since the showdown, surprised everyone. She pushed her way forward, her cynical facade gone, replaced by a look of weary determination. She said that a place for sharing needed books. She had an attic full of empty space above the saloon, a dusty, forgotten loft. She would clean it out, she declared. People could bring their books, their newspapers. It could be a library, a place where people could learn about the world and about each other. She would turn a place of whiskey and forgetting into a place of knowledge and remembering. Cade then spoke of Toby, of the boy's dream to become a blacksmith. He proposed that they build a small smithy as part of this new place, a forge where the boy could learn a trade, where he could mend what was broken and create what was new and useful. And so, the idea for the Stillwater Post was born. It would not belong to any one person or group. It would be a shared resource, a practical symbol of their new, fragile peace. It would have a long, stone-lined trough, providing clean water for any traveler's horse. No questions asked. It would have a small clinic and apothecary run by Dr. Wilson and Neela. It would have May's library in the attic. And it would have Toby's forge, a place of fire and creation. It was a radical idea in a land built on fences and private claims, a community built around a shared wellspring of resources. Construction began the next day, a collective effort of will. Men who had stood on opposite sides of the market square now worked side by side, lifting timbers and hauling stone. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the sound of angry shouts, a new and hopeful music in the dusty air. The Apache brought their knowledge of stonework, showing the settlers how to build a foundation that would last 100 years. The settlers shared their tools and their skills with carpentry. It was a clumsy, difficult partnership, full of awkward silences and hesitant gestures, but it was real. The peace, however, was not complete. The hatred that Rig had planted had deep roots, and some of them were still alive. 3 nights into the construction, a group of men, former ranch hands loyal to Rig, their futures in Dust Mesa now uncertain, acted out of a final, spiteful rage. They rode to a large barn on the outskirts of town, a communal storehouse for winter hay, and set it ablaze. A strong, dry wind was blowing that night, the same kind of wind that had driven the drought. The fire did not just burn, it exploded. The alarm was raised, and the town once again found itself facing a towering inferno. But this time, everything was different. There was no hesitation, no suspicion. Settlers and Apache ran to the fire together. A bucket brigade formed, a single, unbroken line of people, their differences in skin color and language irrelevant in the face of the common enemy. Cade, despite his injured arm, was in the thick of it, organizing the teams, his calm voice cutting through the roar of the flames. Evelyn worked alongside Neela, tending to the burned and the exhausted. Toby, small but fearless, shuttled water buckets back and forth. They fought the fire all night, a desperate, losing battle against the wind and the flames. By morning, the barn was gone, a smoldering skeleton against the dawn sky. A winter's worth of feed, a fortune in hard labor, had been turned to ash. There were injuries, burns and smoke inhalation, but no one had died. As the exhausted survivors stood in the gray light, surveying the devastation, a heavy silence fell. The physical loss was immense, a crippling blow to the community's fragile recovery. The emotional toll was worse. It was a bitter reminder that even with Rig gone, the poison he had spread remained. Later that day, the people gathered again in the market square. They were not there for a trial, but for a council. They were dirty, tired, and demoralized. Old resentments began to surface in their weary faces. The fragile trust they had begun to build felt as flimsy as ash. It was then that Cade stepped onto the unfinished foundation of the Stillwater post. He was not wearing a sling, and the raw, red burn on his forearm was a testament to the night's battle. He looked out at the faces of the community, at the Apache who had lost their homes and the settlers who had now lost their winter supplies. He, who had always preferred silence, knew that this was a time for words. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the square, a low, steady current in the sea of despair. He did not speak of blame or of revenge against the men who had set the fire. He did not offer easy promises or false hope. He spoke a simple, hard truth. "We are all afraid," he began, his gaze moving from face to face. "We are afraid of each other. We are afraid of this land. We are afraid of what we have lost and what we might still lose." He paused, letting the truth of his words sink in. "I will not ask you to trust me," he continued, "and I will not ask the Apache to trust you. Trust is a stone that is built up slowly, over many seasons. We do not have it yet." He took a step forward, his eyes finding Evelyn's in the crowd. "But we can have something else. We do not have to start with trust. We just have to start by not lying." The words were like cool water on a burn. It was a revolutionary idea. He was not asking for a leap of faith. He was asking for a single, achievable act of decency. Stop the rumors, stop the accusations, stop poisoning the well of community with false words. "We will rebuild the barn," he said, his voice gaining strength. "We will share what we have. We will face the winter together, and we will do it by speaking the truth, even when it is hard. That is the only foundation that will last." He stepped down. His speech finished. A long silence followed. But it was not the silence of despair. It was the silence of consideration, of a community looking at itself, at its wounds, and at the difficult, honest path to healing that had just been laid out before them. The victory at Devil's Shelf had been a moment. This, Cade had shown them, was how justice became a habit, a way of life, built one true word at a time. The seasons turned, and the raw wounds of Dust Mesa began to scar over, healing into something new and strong. The Stillwater Post rose from the foundations of goodwill, a testament not to a shared past, but to a chosen future. It was a humble collection of buildings, constructed of local stone and rough-sawn timber, smelling of fresh pine and clean earth. It was a place built by many hands, and it belonged to all of them. The day the water was finally diverted to the long stone trough was a day of quiet celebration. The entire town gathered, a strange and hopeful assembly of settlers in their Sunday best and Apache in their practical buckskins. Reverend Hart said a prayer, but the true ceremony was the silence that fell as the first clear, cold stream of water from Spring Knife gurgled into the trough, a sound of life returning to a thirsty land. Beside the trough, a wooden sign had been erected. On it, carved in 2 languages, were the words, "Still water, drink freely." After the blessing, people stood in awkward, shifting groups. Then the blacksmith, the same man who had torn the star from Shaw's chest, walked across the divide and extended his hand to one of the Apache elders. The elder looked at the offered hand for a long moment before taking it in his own. The handshake was stiff, clumsy, but it was not false. One by one, others followed, the small, difficult gestures of peace rippling through the crowd. It was not forgiveness. It was not forgetting. It was a beginning. In the days that followed, the post became the new heart of the town. Neela and Dr. Wilson's clinic was a constant hub of activity, a place where Apache herbal remedies and settler surgical tools worked in tandem. In the loft above the copper lantern, May's library was taking shape, its shelves slowly filling with donated books and old newspapers, a repository of words in a town that was learning a new language of coexistence. And at the heart of it all was the rhythmic metallic song of Toby's hammer striking his anvil. The boy, under the tutelage of the town blacksmith, was finding his calling, his small forge a place of constant, useful creation. Evelyn reopened her school, but it was not the same. She moved it to a small room at the back of the Stillwater Post. Above the door, she hung a new sign, painted by her own hand. It read, "The Spring and Spine School." It was a place, she explained to her new and more diverse group of students, to learn about the sources of things, the well springs of life and knowledge, and to develop the moral backbone to protect them. Apache and settler children sat side by side on the rough wooden benches, learning their letters together, their futures intertwined. One late afternoon, after a summer shower had washed the dust from the air and left the world smelling clean and new, Cade led Evelyn up a high, rocky ridge that overlooked the entire valley. The grasslands below were a vibrant, impossible green, and the setting sun broke through the clouds, painting the wet landscape in strokes of gold and fire. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the light change, feeling the peace of the vast, open space. The past months had been a whirlwind of work, of building and mending, both structures and relationships. This was the first moment of true stillness they had shared in a long time. The easy intimacy they had found in the rainy shelter had deepened, evolving into a quiet, unspoken partnership that was the bedrock of the new community. Evelyn leaned against him, feeling the steady strength of his body. She looked at his face, at the old scar that was now just a part of a landscape she had come to love. She thought of the whispers that had once followed him, the reputation for violence that had clung to him like a shroud. And she thought of the man she now knew, the man who had faced down hatred with stillness, who had met violence with sacrifice. He must have felt her thoughts because he turned to her, his dark eyes soft in the golden light. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. He spoke, and his voice was as quiet as the evening air, a secret shared with her in the wide, listening sky. "The heart of a mountain Apache does not beat loud to show its strength," he said. "It beats soft so as not to drown out the voice of the one he loves." She felt the truth of his words settle deep within her, a peace that was more profound than any she had ever known. She had spent her life listening for the loud proclamations of faith and law, but she had found her truth in the quiet, steady rhythm of this man's heart. Later that night, by the light of a kerosene lamp, Evelyn sat at a small wooden desk in her schoolroom. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and a pen and began to write. It was a letter to a recipient who would never read it, a conversation with a ghost. She wrote to her mother, telling her of the long, strange journey that had brought her here. She wrote of her fears, of her discoveries, of the man who had taught her that love was not a fortress to be defended, but an open space to be shared. It was a letter of release, a final closing of a chapter of grief, and the beginning of a new one of joy. As she wrote, Cade sat at another table, a piece of tanned hide spread before him, with a quill and ink. He was painstakingly writing out the new community agreement regarding the shared use of the spring knife water. He wrote it first in English, the formal, legal language of the settlers. Then beneath it, he wrote it again, using the symbolic characters of the Apache language. It was a document of two worlds, a treaty of peace written not by governments, but by the people themselves. Their quiet work was a portrait of the new Dust Mesa, a place where different languages and different ways of knowing were coming together to create a shared future. Their individual acts of writing, one a personal catharsis, the other a public pact, were two sides of the same coin, two parts of the same story of healing. The community, too, was finding its own new rhythms. Neela had taken on a young apprentice, a settler girl fascinated by the healing power of plants. May, with her sharp mind for numbers, had been elected the treasurer of the Stillwater Post, her ledger now tracking donations and expenses instead of saloon debts. One evening, Toby came to Cade and Evelyn as they sat by the fire outside the post. He was shy, his face smudged with soot, but his eyes were shining with pride. In his calloused hand, he held a small object. It was a ring, forged from a single piece of dark iron. It was not ornate or polished. It was simple, strong, and perfectly round, bearing the faint, beautiful marks of the hammer that had shaped it. It was a thing made of hard work and honest intention. He held it out to them, a gift for the two people who had given him a future. Cade took the ring. He looked at it. Then he looked at Evelyn, her face glowing in the firelight. This was not a moment for grand proposals or whispered promises in a church. This was their life, a life of practical work, of shared burdens, of a love forged in fire and tempered by hardship. He took her hand and slipped the simple iron ring onto her finger. It was not a symbol of ownership, but of partnership. It was a promise, not of ease, but of endurance, a promise to stand together, side by side, as long as the dust of the West continued to blow. The story of the Stillwater Post began to travel, carried by drifters and cattle drivers who stopped to water their horses at the free trough. They would see the bilingual sign, the shared clinic, the children of all colors learning together in the small school. They would feel the strange, quiet peace of the place. And before they left, many would drop a small coin, a penny or a nickel, into a heavy wooden box that stood near the trough. There was no sign asking for payment. The box was simply there, a vessel for a promise. Each coin was a small act of faith, A belief that what was happening in Dust Mesa was not just a fleeting truce, but the beginning of a new and better story. Thank you for being part of our journey through this story. Please comment with where you are listening from in the world to connect with our community. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Tales, like this video, and hit the hype button to help us share these tales with more people.